In this video, we will look at the structure of synapse and explain the mechanism of synaptic transmission across synapses. Basically, synapse is the junction between two neurons, presynaptic neuron and postsynaptic neuron. Presynaptic neuron is where the impulse comes from, and the postsynaptic neuron is the neuron that will accept the impulse. As you can see in the diagram here, this is the presynaptic neuron where the impulse travels through across the axon until it reaches the axon terminal or the synapse, and in the synapse will then transfer the impulse to the postsynaptic neuron. This is the structure of synapse, where first we have the synaptic knob. This is the knob. Inside the knob, we contain synaptic vesicle. Inside the vesicle have neurotransmitter molecules inside the synaptic vesicle. Inside the synaptic vesicle, we have the neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitter are basically chemical stuff. And then in between the postsynaptic membrane and the presynaptic membrane is the synaptic cleft. Synaptic cleft basically like a gap between the two neurons. And on the postsynaptic membrane, we have the receptor site. This receptor will receive the neurotransmitter. Now let's look at the mechanism of impulse transmission across synapse. First, we have when the action potential arrives at the synaptic knob of the axon terminal of the presynaptic membrane. This is the presynaptic membrane. The presynaptic membrane will undergo depolarization. This depolarization will open the voltage-gated calcium ion channel. When this voltage-gated calcium ion channel open, calcium ion from the outside environment can enter into the synaptic knob. The diffusion of calcium ion trigger for the synaptic vesicle to fuse with the presynaptic membrane. The vesicle then rupture to release the neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft via exocytosis. Then the released neurotransmitter will diffuse across the synaptic cleft and bind to the receptor of the ligand-gated sodium ion channels on the postsynaptic membrane. This is the postsynaptic membrane, the second neuron. Okay, so the neurotransmitter will diffuse out and diffuse along the synaptic cleft and bind to the ligand-gated sodium ion channel on the postsynaptic membrane. Binding of the neurotransmitter on the ligand-gated sodium ion channel causes the ion channel to open. This opening will cause influx of sodium ion into the neuron. The sodium ion, when it is influxed into the neuron, it will cause depolarization of the second neuron, the postsynaptic membrane. When the depolarization reach threshold level, action potential will happen in the second neuron. When the second neuron experience the depolarization, experience the action potential, then the impulse can be transmitted on the axon of the second neuron. Once the impulse is transmitted to the postsynaptic membrane, the neurotransmitter will be degraded by the specific enzyme in the synaptic cleft, and the degraded neurotransmitter will reabsorb back into the presynaptic knob by endocytosis. This when the neurotransmitter no longer bind to the gate, the ligand-gated sodium ion channel will be closed. When the channel is closed, no more sodium ion can enter the cell, causing the activity to stop. You can see how once the action potential reach the synaptic knob, causing for the synaptic vesicle to fuse with the synaptic membrane and rupture, releasing the neurotransmitter to the synaptic cleft. And then the neurotransmitter will bind with the receptor on the postsynaptic membrane. The receptor, the ligand-gated sodium ion channel, will open and causing the sodium ion to diffuse into the postsynaptic membrane, causing depolarization, causing action potential to happen in the postsynaptic membrane. Now let's look at the mechanism of action of drugs, example cocaine, on the nervous system, on our neuron. A stimulant drug, such as cocaine, can affect the nerve cell at the brain limbic system, our body's pleasure center. The neurotransmitter transmit through the synaptic cleft is dopamine. In normal condition, dopamine is reabsorbed back into the presynaptic membrane after triggering action potential at the postsynaptic membrane. But cocaine, once it enters the synaptic cleft, it will bind to the dopamine transporter molecule. In normal condition, the dopamine is released to the synaptic cleft, and then once it has triggered the action potential, it will diffuse back into the presynaptic knob. But when cocaine present, cocaine will bind to the dopamine transporter. Basically, what it will do, it will block the dopamine transporter. Dopamine cannot diffuse back into the presynaptic knob. When this happens, it causes for the dopamine to stay inside the synaptic cleft. When the dopamine stays in the synaptic cleft, the dopamine will keep on binding to the dopamine receptor on the postsynaptic neuron. This will cause a continuous impulse transmission. The impulse will keep on transmitted to the next neuron, and it will produce an intense feeling of pleasure, euphoria. Continuous usage of cocaine will cause the dopamine receptor here to be reduced. When the cocaine is no longer taken and dopamine levels return to their normal concentration, the smaller number of dopamine receptor, it will not be enough to give a new effect, because the number of dopamine receptor has reduced due to the excessive use of cocaine before. So to produce the same pleasure, high level of dopamine is required. When they need high dopamine, means that they will also need a high level of cocaine. This will cause addiction on the cocaine, and overdose can cause suicide.